All right, how's it going, guys? Today we're going to be going over solving quadratic equations by taking square roots, day 2. Okay, so imaginary numbers are what the square root of negative numbers are. We've been told, I know y'all have been told a lot, you cannot take the square root of negative numbers. That's not completely true. There actually is a way, and we can do that with imaginary numbers. All right, in an imaginary unit, I is defined as negative square root of negative 1. And what that means is that I equals the square root of negative 1. And therefore, I squared is going to give us negative 1, right? Since I squared is going to give us square root of negative 1 multiplied by the square root of negative 1. And if you multiply a square root with itself, all you do is get rid of the square root. So square root of negative 1 times square root of negative 1 is just going to give you 1, or like we said up here, I squared equals negative 1. Okay? So let's go on and solve some problems. I'm going to pick a few and solve those. So for A, what we want to do when we're solving it, what I like to do, what I prefer to teach, is to split it up to the square root of a negative 1 and the square root of a 4. Right? Like we said above, the square root of a negative 1 is I. And we're going to multiply that with the square root of 4, and the square root of 4 is 2. So we end up getting the square root of negative 4 equals 2i. So what you want to do is split up the square root of a negative number to a square root of negative 1 and a square root of 4. And we can do that since we have two square roots and you multiply them together. You multiply what's underneath the square root and put that underneath one square root. So right here, the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 4 is the same thing as saying square root of negative 4. Right? So break it down that way. It will make your life much easier. Let's go on and do C. C gives a square root of negative 12. We can break that down. Same thing. Negative 1 square root of 12. Just square root of negative 1 that we said is I. That's not writing right. So it's square root of I. Or sorry, just I. And the square root of 12. We can go ahead and just do a prime factorization of it to break it down. 12 can be 2 and 6. And 6 can be 3 and 2. We have a pair of 2's here. So you can take out a 2. So the square root of 12 is the same thing as 2 root 3. Or we can write this as 2i root 3. Okay? So that's what the square root of negative 12 is. All right, let's go on and we'll do D and D as well. There's a little typo. We'll do them both. So the square root of negative 13, like we said, we're going to split it up. The square root of 13 and the square root of negative 1. Square root of 13, 13 is prime, so it just stays as it is. And the square root of negative 1 is just I. So here we get I square root of 13. Okay, so let's go ahead and do D as well. We're going to start like we did every other problem. We're going to split it up. The square root of negative 1 multiplied by the square root of 72. The square root of negative 1 just becomes I. And now we can deal with the square root of 72 like we have been for, for instance, the day 1 of these notes, right? So square root of 72, let's go ahead and break it down. We get 72. We'll make a little tree, 2 and 36. 36 becomes 6 and 6. And these both become 3 and 2. And we see we have 1, 2, 1, 2, 3 2s, I'm sorry, and 2 3s. So we have one pair of 2s, one pair of 3, and we have a 2 left over. So we times the 2 with the 3, we're multiplying what we pull out of it. So we end up getting 6 root 2 multiplied by that I we have over here. We're going to bring that I down. Or in other words, we have 6i root 2. So what we want to do to solve these out is we want to split it up into the square root of a negative 1 and the square root of whatever's left over. And you're going to solve what's left over. So in this case, the square root of 72, we're going to solve that out for the simplest way you can. You're going to simplify it. And in this case, we get 6 root 2. Right? So I'm going to leave, I think it's B and E for you guys to do on your own. And we're going to keep going. All right, so here we're told to find the square of the imaginary number. So when we say find the square of an imaginary number or find the square of anything, we mean raise it to the second power. So in this case, we have 5i. We're going to multiply that with 5i as well. Remember, you're squaring anything, you're multiplying it with itself. And what we do here is you multiply coefficient with coefficient, so 5 with 5, that gives us 25. And then we multiply I with I, variable with variable. I times I gives us I squared. Okay, and we're not done here because we have to simplify this a little more. Remember from the last slide, we said I squared equals -1, right? So if that's the case, we have 25 multiplied by -1 or -25. Okay, so let's go on to 2. For 2, we're going to do the same thing. We're squaring it. So we're going to multiply it with itself, -I root 2, multiply with -I root 2. And we're going to do the same thing, multiply variable with variable. So -I times -I gives us a positive I squared. Remember, any negative number multiplied with another negative number gives you a positive. Negative gives you a positive. And we have 2 i's, so it's I squared. So root 2 times root 2 is going to give us root 4. And I to the second power is -1, or I squared is -1. And the square root of 4 is 2. So we get -1 multiplied by 2. Or we can just say -2. And that's what our answer for this one is going to be. All right, 3 is very similar to number 1, so I'll let you guys do it yourselves. But we're going to work on number 4. That was a little more difficult, so we're going to work on that. So we have, for number 4, we have root 3 all over 3i, and we want to square it. Okay? So like I said before, we're going to square something. We're going to multiply it with itself. So we get root 3 all over 3i, multiply with root 3 all over 3i. And we're going to do the same thing, coefficient with coefficient, variable with variable. So root 3 over 3 multiplied by root 3 over 3 is fraction, so we multiply across. So root 3 times root 3 gives us root 9. And 3 times 3 gives us 9. And then I times I gives us I squared. So that's what we're left with. So let's go ahead and rewrite this down here in the bottom. Give ourselves a little more room. So we have root 9 over 9, I squared. The square root of 9 is just 3. That's all over 9. And I squared is -1. And we can reduce this some more. 3 over 9 is the same thing as 1/3. So we get -1 all over 3 as our answer. Okay. Let's keep going. Now we have some quadratic equations. To be very similar to day 1, except in this case we have imaginary numbers. Okay. So let's go on and do number 1. We're going to -12 on both sides. Like we always do, remember we isolate the x squared term, and then we take the square root of both sides, right? So we get x squared equals -12. Then we're going to take the square root of both sides. And remember, if we ever take a square root of a variable, we put plus or minus. So we have x equals plus or minus the square root of -12. And we need to split this up, right? -12 is the same thing as -1 and 12. And like we saw before, we can do the prime factorization of square root of 12. It'd be a 4 and 3, 2 and 2. We have a pair of 2's here. So we get 2 root 3. So this is the same thing as saying plus or minus 2 root 3i. We rewrite that because the I should be right after the 2. So the same thing is plus or minus 2i root 3. The 2 root 3 from the 12 and the I from the square root of the -1. All right. Let's go on to number 2 as well. We're going to isolate the x squared term. So minus the 11 on both sides. We're left with 4x squared equals -5. Divide by 4. Divide by 4. We get x squared equals -5 all over 4. And we're going to take the square root now, right? So take the square root of all of it. And when we take a square root of a fraction, what you want to do is distribute that square root to the top and bottom. So the square root of x squared is x. That's going to be plus or minus. We're going to distribute that square root to the top and bottom, like I said. Square root of -5 and the square root of 4. All right, so let's go ahead and solve this out. The square root of -5 It's the same thing as square root of -1 multiplied with square root of 5, and square root of 4 is just 2. So what we get is x equals plus or minus square root of -1 is I, so we get I root 5 all over 2. Okay, let's go ahead and do number 3. So what we're going to do is minus the 9 on both sides. So we get 1/4 x squared equals -9, because remember, we have to isolate the x squared term before we take the square. And then we're going to get rid of the 1/4. We multiply it by the reciprocal, which is 4 over 1. So we multiply that on both sides. Let's put the -9 over 1 as well. 4 over 1. These 4's cancel, and we're left with x squared equals -9 times 4 is -36. Now we're going to take the square root of both sides. And the square root of x squared is just x. That equals plus or minus the square root of -36, which is the same thing as plus or minus the square root of -1 times the square root of 36, which is the same thing as plus or minus square root of -1 is I, multiplied with the square root of 36 is 6. So we can rewrite this all by saying x equals plus or minus 6i. Number 5 is going to be very similar to number 2 and number 3. So I'm going to leave that for you guys to do on by yourselves. We do post the completed notes online, so you can double check the work there. But that's pretty much the section, guys. So the biggest thing to remember is just that I equals the square root of -1. You cannot actually take the square root of a negative number. You still really can't. What we can do is take out the square root of the -1 and change that square root of -1 to an I. So that's kind of the biggest thing of this chapter, guys. All right.